I still remember the night it finally sunk in, that I was no longer Daniel Carter, respected teacher, husband, and father. I was Daniel Carter, discarded. Our story begins in Charleston, South Carolina, a city of manicured gardens, antebellum mansions, and cobblestone streets. The kind of place where the past is impossible to ignore, especially when you're a history teacher like me. Julia and I had built our life there, or at least I thought we had. She was my world, radiant, ambitious, and full of laughter. I had met her in college at a fundraiser for the library restoration. She was wearing this navy dress that clung to her like a second skin, her golden hair spilling over her shoulders. I thought I'd won the lottery, and for a while, it felt like I had. We got married, bought a modest but charming colonial-style home in Mount Pleasant, and welcomed our daughter, Sophia, not long after. She was a firecracker from the start, her green eyes always alive with curiosity. I'd spend hours reading to her under the old oak in our backyard, reciting Poe, Austen, and Shakespeare. She was my everything. But Julia, it turned out, wanted more than everything. I first noticed the change after Sophia turned 14. Julia began dropping phrases like, "We deserve better," or "Imagine what life could be like if we didn't have to worry about money." I chalked it up to her usual restlessness. Julia was never the type to be content. She had this fire in her, a hunger for the finer things. It's part of what drew me to her, but over time, it became clear that my stability, the very thing she'd once admired, was now a disappointment. Her dissatisfaction came to a head one spring evening. Sophia was upstairs, likely FaceTiming one of her friends about high school gossip, while I graded essays on To Kill a Mockingbird at the kitchen table. Julia walked in, dressed to the nines in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Daniel," she began, her voice tight, "do you ever think about what it would be like if we didn't have to scrape by every month? If we didn't have to drive that clunker or skip vacations?" I looked up from my papers. "We don't scrape by. We're doing fine. Better than most." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fine? Daniel, fine isn't enough. Fine is mediocre." I set my pen down, trying to read her expression. "Where is this coming from, Julia?" She shrugged, her diamond bracelet glinting under the kitchen light. "I just think we could do better. That's all." What I didn't know then was that she already had her sights set on better. His name was Victor Langston, and he was everything I wasn't. Victor was a name you heard often in Charleston's upper echelons. He owned half the luxury hotels on the coast, from the opulent Ritz-Carlton in Amelia Island to the sleek Langston Plaza in Savannah. He drove a silver Aston Martin, hosted fundraisers that drew senators and celebrities, and wore suits that probably had their own zip codes. I'd seen him once, at a charity gala Julia had dragged me to. He was surrounded by a gaggle of women dripping in Cartier, his smile sharp and polished. I remember thinking he looked like a wolf dressed as a man. It wasn't until Sophia found them that everything unraveled. The night it happened, I was grading again. An endless pile of sophomore essays on Romeo and Juliet. Julia had claimed she was meeting friends for dinner downtown. Sophia had gone out with her own friends, but came home early, her face pale as a ghost. "Dad," she said, standing in the doorway. Her voice wavered. "I need to tell you something." I set my pen down. "What is it, sweetheart?" She hesitated, her fingers gripping the strap of her backpack. I saw Mom. She wasn't at dinner with her friends. She was with some guy. They were holding hands." The words hit me like a freight train, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Are you sure?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It was Victor Langston. They were at that new rooftop bar on King Street. Victor Langston. Of course it was him." Julia came home that night reeking of perfume and champagne. I confronted her in the kitchen, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Sophia saw you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "With Victor." She froze, her face paling. But then she straightened, her chin tilting defiantly. "And?" That one word broke something inside me. "And? Julia, you're cheating on me. On us. On this family." She scoffed. "Don't be so dramatic, Daniel. You act like I haven't been miserable for years. Do you even know what it's like to be married to someone with no ambition?" Someone who's content to rot in mediocrity while the rest of the world thrives. I stared at her, speechless. Mediocrity? Julia, I've given you everything I could. Everything. It's not enough, she said simply, brushing past me. It never was. The divorce was swift and brutal. Julia left with Victor, taking Sophia with her. She claimed she needed a fresh start, and that Sophia deserved to experience a better life. I tried to fight for custody, but my modest teacher's salary was no match for Victor's legal team. Sophia refused to speak to me. When I called, she let it ring. When I visited, she wouldn't come to the door. And when I wrote letters, they were returned unopened. I'd lost her too. For months after they left, I went through the motions like a ghost. I taught my classes, graded my papers, and came home to an empty house. The silence was deafening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, my mind racing with memories of family dinners, lazy Sundays, and bedtime stories. They haunted me like specters, reminders of what I'd lost. My colleagues noticed the change. Claire Matthews, the school counselor, tried to talk to me during lunch one day. "Daniel," she said gently, her brow furrowed with concern, "you're not yourself. Have you thought about talking to someone? A therapist?" I shook my head. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. I was a broken man clinging to the edges of a life that no longer felt like my own. One evening, months later, I found myself at the local bookstore, aimlessly wandering the aisles. I picked up a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, a book I hadn't read since college. Its story of betrayal, reinvention, and calculated revenge struck a chord I hadn't expected. I devoured it in a single weekend, and by the end, I felt something I hadn't in months: purpose. If my life was ruined, I would rebuild it. Not for Julia, not for Sophia, but for myself. I quit my job the following week, sold the house, packed a single suitcase, and booked a one-way ticket to Paris. Charleston held nothing for me anymore. My new life awaited. And so, Daniel Carter, the teacher, the husband, the father, died. In his place, a new man was born. The letter sat on the dining table, its edges curling slightly in the humidity of a Charleston evening. It was short, just a few paragraphs written in my careful handwriting. I must have rewritten it a dozen times before I finally settled on those final words. "Dear Sophia, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I hope you do. I want you to know that I loved you more than anything in this world. Every decision I made, every sacrifice, was for you. I tried to be the best father I could, but I see now that I wasn't enough. Not for you, not for your mother. I'm leaving Charleston. There's nothing left for me here. Please don't think this is your fault. It's just something I have to do to survive. I'll always love you, and I'll always be proud of you, no matter where life takes you. Goodbye, my sweet girl. Love, Dad." When I placed the letter on the table, I felt like I was severing the last thread tying me to my old life. It wasn't a clean cut. It tore jaggedly, leaving fragments behind. But it was necessary. For months, I'd been drowning in the wreckage of my marriage, my career, and my role as a father. I needed air, and Charleston had none left to give me. I packed light, just a suitcase with a few clothes, my favorite books, and a leather-bound journal I'd bought on a whim years ago. The house felt emptier than ever as I walked through it one last time. The walls echoed with memories. Julia laughing as she cooked Sunday dinners, Sophia practicing piano in the living room. The three of us huddled together during a rare winter storm. I knew I'd never return, but I still locked the door behind me, as if protecting the ghosts that remained. At the airport, I stood at the counter and purchased a ticket to Paris. It wasn't a city I'd ever been to, but it felt right. Romantic, historic, a place where reinvention seemed not only possible but inevitable. When the agent asked for my name, I hesitated. Daniel Carter was a relic of the past, a man defined by heartbreak and failure. I needed something new. "David Calloway," I said, the name slipping out before I could second-guess it. The agent nodded, typing it into the system. And just like that, Daniel Carter ceased to exist. The flight to Paris was uneventful, though my mind churned the entire way. I stared out the window as the Atlantic stretched endlessly below, a dark, shifting void that mirrored my thoughts. Who was I now? What would I become? When the plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I was a stranger in a foreign land, untethered and free. The air smelled different here, tinged with the faint aroma of fresh baguettes and diesel from passing taxis. Paris was alive in a way Charleston never was, its streets humming with possibility. I rented a modest apartment in the 6th arrondissement, just off Rue de Rennes. It was a far cry from the colonial charm of my old home, but its simplicity suited me. The floors were worn wood, the windows framed by peeling shutters, and the view overlooked a bustling cafe where locals sipped espresso and debated politics. It was perfect. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in the city. By day, I wandered the winding streets, exploring hidden courtyards and centuries-old cathedrals. By night, I sat at the cafe beneath my apartment, scribbling in my journal and nursing glasses of Bordeaux. My French was laughable at first, but I picked up phrases quickly, learning to order croissants at the boulangerie and navigate the metro with relative ease. I avoided looking back. The letter I'd left for Sophia weighed heavily on my mind, but I forced myself to push it aside. This was my chance to start over, to build a life free from the shadows of betrayal. Paris offered me something I hadn't expected. Opportunity. One evening, as I sipped coffee at a dimly lit bookstore in the Latin Quarter, I struck up a conversation with a man named Etienne Moreau. He was a publisher, the kind of man who spoke with his hands and wore scarves regardless of the weather. When he learned I was a former teacher, he lit up. "You Americans," he said, grinning, "always so serious about your literature. Come, tell me, what do you think of Hugo? Balzac?" We spent hours debating the merits of French versus American writers, and by the end of the night, Etienne offered me a job. It wasn't glamorous, editing English translations of French novels, but it was a start, and it paid enough to keep me afloat. The months turned into years, and I slowly carved out a new identity. As David Calloway, I was no longer the man who had been betrayed. I was an editor, a writer, a man of quiet means and private ambition. I invested what little I earned in the stock market, taking calculated risks that, to my surprise, paid off handsomely. By my 3rd year in Paris, I'd accumulated enough to buy a small flat in Le Marais, a far cry from my modest beginnings in Charleston. But even as I built this new life, I couldn't completely sever my ties to the past. Once a year, I hired a private investigator to check in on Sophia. It was a quiet ritual, one I approached with equal parts dread and hope. Through his reports, I learned that she'd graduated high school with honors and gone on to study art history at NYU. She was thriving in a way that made my heart ache with pride and sorrow. Julia, on the other hand, had married Victor Langston. Their photos appeared in society pages, Julia draped in designer gowns, Victor flashing his signature wolfish grin. It didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was when the investigator reported their divorce. Victor had left Julia for a younger woman, a model from Milan. Julia had fought for alimony, but Victor's lawyers buried her in paperwork until she settled for a fraction of what she demanded. By then, Sophia had distanced herself from both of them, choosing to focus on her studies instead. Paris changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I learned to appreciate the quiet elegance of life, the art of savoring a perfectly brewed espresso, the warmth of a well-worn book, the thrill of a calculated investment. But the scars of my past remained, faint but undeniable. One evening, as I stood on the Pont Neuf watching the Seine ripple under the city lights, I thought of Sophia. She was the only part of my old life I still held on to, the one thread I couldn't let go. And though I'd promised myself I'd never return to Charleston, I knew deep down that one day I might have to. For now, though, I was content to wait, to watch and to build. Because when I did return, it wouldn't be as the broken man they'd left behind. It would be as someone entirely new. The years in Europe were a masterclass in reinvention. When I first arrived in Paris, I was a broken man scraping by on meager wages, clinging to the hope that I could somehow outrun my past. By the time I set foot in my new villa in Lake Como a decade later, I had become someone else entirely. David Calloway, a name that once felt like an ill-fitting suit, was now synonymous with success. It began with small investments. Through Etienne Moreau, my first employer in Paris, I was introduced to a network of writers, publishers, and business people. One evening at a dinner party, I overheard a guest talking about a tech startup in Berlin. It was the sort of speculative venture that had the potential to fail spectacularly, or make someone very, very rich. I didn't hesitate. Using the modest savings I'd accrued, I bought in, and for the first time in years, fortune smiled on me. That startup, later acquired by a major corporation, turned my initial investment into a small fortune. From there, I dove deeper into the world of venture capital, guided by instinct and a quiet hunger to prove myself. By my 5th year in Europe, I had built an empire. My portfolio stretched across industries, tech, real estate, renewable energy, and spanned cities from London to Milan. I bought a villa in Lake Como, perched high above the shimmering water, its sprawling gardens lined with olive trees and stone pathways. My garage housed a collection of cars I'd only dreamed of in my former life. A sleek black Aston Martin, a classic Porsche 911, and a Ferrari that roared like thunder when I pressed the accelerator. And yet, despite the opulence, there was a void. My success was a fortress, shielding me from the pain of betrayal, but also locking me in a cage of my own making. I spent countless nights sitting alone on the villa's terrace, sipping wine as the sun set over the lake. The memories I tried to bury, Julia's laughter, Sophia's tiny hand gripping mine as we crossed the street, would resurface like ghosts, uninvited and unrelenting. While I thrived, Julia's world crumbled. The investigator I'd hired sent regular updates, each one painting a bleaker picture. After Victor Langston divorced her, Julia fought to maintain her social standing, but without his fortune, she struggled. The designer gowns and extravagant vacations were replaced by thrifted outfits and weekend getaways to second-rate destinations. She moved into a modest apartment in North Charleston, a far cry from the mansion she'd once shared with Victor. Her pride, however, remained intact. She still attended galas, her charm intact but her desperation palpable. Friends abandoned her one by one, and the society pages stopped printing her name. It wasn't revenge I sought, at least not consciously, but seeing her fall. The reports about Sophia, however, cut deeper. She had graduated from NYU and returned to Charleston with aspirations of becoming an art curator. For a while, it seemed she was thriving, building a promising career and mingling with the kind of people Julia had always idolized. But then came Ethan Gray. I'd never met him, but the investigator's description was damning. Ethan was charming, good-looking, and as shallow as a puddle. He worked as a real estate agent, though worked seemed generous. His commissions barely covered his lifestyle, which included gambling and a taste for expensive whiskey. When Sophia fell for him, she fell hard. He moved into her small apartment, draining her savings while stringing her along with promises of a future that would never come. And then, when she became pregnant, he left. I received the investigator's update on a rainy evening in Milan. I was in my penthouse suite, nursing an espresso and reviewing contracts for a new venture in renewable energy. The words blurred as I read them. Ethan Gray has left Sophia Carter. She is currently 5 months pregnant, unemployed, and living off credit cards. I set the report down, my chest tightening. Sophia, my Sophia, was facing the same abandonment I'd endured. The thought of her alone, vulnerable, and betrayed was unbearable. For years, I'd convinced myself I could live without her. But this was different. This was blood. It wasn't an easy choice. For over a decade, I'd built my life around the idea that I would never return to Charleston. That city was a graveyard of memories, and Julia was its gatekeeper. But Sophia wasn't Julia. She was my daughter. And though she had once turned her back on me, I couldn't do the same to her. I spent days agonizing over the decision. On one hand, helping her would mean reopening old wounds, facing Julia, and confronting a past I'd buried. On the other, I knew that if I did nothing, I would never forgive myself. In the end, the choice was clear. I called my assistant, a sharp-witted woman named Elena, who had worked for me since my early days in Paris. "Elena," I said, my voice firm, "I need you to book a flight to Charleston." She paused, her surprise evident even over the phone. "Charleston, South Carolina?" "Yes." "When?" "As soon as possible." Before leaving, I made arrangements. I had no intention of staying in Charleston long, but I wanted to ensure Sophia's future was secure. Through my network, I contacted a prominent Charleston lawyer and instructed him to draft documents for a trust fund. It would cover her living expenses, medical bills, and the early years of her child's life. She would never have to rely on anyone like Ethan again. As for Julia, I made my position clear. I would not offer her a single cent. Whatever hardship she faced was her own doing, and I refused to be her savior. On the flight to Charleston, I stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by. It felt surreal to return after so many years. I wondered how much the city had changed, how much I had changed. The man who left Charleston a decade ago was dead. In his place was someone wealthier, wiser, and far less forgiving. When the plane touched down, the humid air hit me like a wall. Memories flooded back, the cobblestone streets, the smell of magnolias in bloom, the distant hum of church bells. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This wasn't a homecoming. It was a mission, and it began with Sophia. The wheels of my Bentley Bentayga crunched against the gravel driveway of Charleston's most exclusive inn, the Cypress Grove. The car gleamed under the late afternoon sun, its dark sapphire finish reflecting the grandeur of the sprawling oaks and Spanish moss that framed the entrance. Heads turned as I stepped out, impeccably dressed in a tailored Brunello Cucinelli suit, a Patek Philippe watch glinting on my wrist. I could feel their stares, the whispers of recognition, disbelief, and envy from those who remembered me as Daniel Carter, the high school teacher who had disappeared without a trace. Now, I was a man of wealth, power, and mystery. David Calloway. Driving through Charleston had been an experience in itself. The pastel-colored row houses of Rainbow Row stood as vivid as ever, their facades weathered but proud. The cobblestone streets were still uneven, still charmingly treacherous. Yet something about the city felt smaller, almost provincial, in comparison to the world I'd come to know. I passed familiar landmarks, the bookstore where I used to grade essays over coffee, the park where Sophia learned to ride her bike, the seafood shack Julia and I frequented in our early years. Each place stirred memories I'd spent years suppressing, but I forced myself to focus. I hadn't come back for nostalgia. I had come for Sophia. The first encounter was inevitable. News of my return spread faster than gossip at a country club brunch. Julia had likely heard whispers before I even finished checking into the Cypress Grove. It was 2 days later when I saw her. I was stepping out of the car on King Street, a Cartier bag in hand, when she appeared. Her face was a shadow of its former self, still beautiful but lined with the stress of years spent clawing for relevance. She wore a dress that, while elegant, lacked the effortless glamour she once commanded. "Daniel," she called, her voice wavering as she hurried toward me. I turned slowly, letting her take in the man I'd become. Her eyes scanned me, from the precision of my suit to the gleaming car parked behind me. She stopped a few feet away, uncertain, her lips parting as if to say something more. "It's David now," I said coolly, my tone as sharp as the Charleston breeze. She blinked, stunned. "David, I didn't know you were back. You look," she faltered, the words catching in her throat. "Different," I supplied, raising an eyebrow. "We all change, Julia, some more than others." She reached out, as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back, my gaze steely. "If you'll excuse me, I have somewhere to be." "Daniel, wait," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, can we talk? Just for a moment." I hesitated, letting her feel the weight of the silence before answering. "There's nothing to discuss. Whatever we had ended a long time ago." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, a relic of a life I no longer recognized. The knock on my hotel door came late that evening. I opened it to find Sophia standing there, her green eyes red-rimmed and full of tears. She looked so much like the little girl I used to read to under the oak tree, yet now she carried an air of exhaustion, her once vibrant spirit dulled by hardship. "Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it meant confronting more than just the room beyond. Finally, She walked in, clutching her hands nervously. "Sit," I said, motioning to the armchair by the window. I remained standing, watching her as she fidgeted, struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, tears spilling over. "I'm so sorry for everything, for how I treated you, for choosing Mom over you, for believing everything she said." Her words were raw, tumbling out in a flood of guilt and regret. I stayed silent, letting her speak. "I thought she was right," Sophia continued, her voice breaking. "I thought you didn't have enough ambition, that you were the reason we weren't happy. But now I see how wrong I was. Mom," she paused, swallowing hard. "She's not the person I thought she was. And I'm not the person I thought I'd be." I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights as I composed myself. Finally, I turned to face her. "What do you want from me, Sophia?" I need your help," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do. Ethan's gone. I can't raise this baby alone. I don't even have a job." Her vulnerability cut through the walls I'd spent years building. For a moment, I saw her not as the teenager who had abandoned me, but as my daughter, lost and afraid. "I'll help you," I said, my tone firm but measured. "But let me make one thing clear. This isn't about Julia. My relationship with her is over. It's beyond repair. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded quickly, her relief palpable. "I understand. Thank you, Dad. Thank you so much." The next morning, I met with my lawyer to finalize the trust fund. It would ensure Sophia and her child would never have to rely on anyone again. But I was clear about my conditions. Julia was to have no access to the money. This was for Sophia and Sophia alone. Later that day, I sat with Sophia at a quiet cafe overlooking the harbor. We talked, truly talked, for the first time in years. She told me about her life, her dreams, and the mistakes that had brought her here. I listened, my heart aching for the years we'd lost but hopeful for the connection we were rebuilding. As I watched her, I realized that this was why I had returned. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for her. Sophia was my redemption, the one piece of my old life worth saving. In the weeks that followed, I remained in Charleston, working behind the scenes to stabilize Sophia's life. I found her a new apartment, ensured her medical care was covered, and introduced her to contacts who could help her restart her career. Slowly, she began to find her footing. As for Julia, our paths crossed once more, but I kept my distance. She tried to approach me at a charity event, her tone pleading, but I cut her off before she could begin. "Julia," I said, my voice like ice, "whatever forgiveness you're looking for, you won't find it here." Her face crumpled, but I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I felt free. Ethan Gray was exactly as I'd imagined. All charm on the surface, but hollow underneath. When I first laid eyes on him, he was seated at the bar of a mid-tier steakhouse in downtown Charleston, wearing a too-tight blazer and a smirk that said he thought the world owed him something. I had tracked him down through a private investigator I'd hired weeks ago. Ethan hadn't strayed far since abandoning Sophia. He was still in town, coasting by on whatever scraps he could scavenge from his latest schemes. His debt was mounting, his reputation crumbling. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. As I approached, he didn't notice me at first. He was too busy flirting with the bartender, leaning in too close, his teeth bared in what he probably thought was a winning grin. When I slid onto the stool next to him, he finally turned, his expression shifting from confident to wary in an instant. "You must be Ethan Gray," I said, my voice calm but unmistakably firm. He blinked, trying to place me. "Who's asking?" "David Calloway," I replied, leaning in just enough to make him uncomfortable. "Sophia Carter's father." The blood drained from his face, but he quickly covered it with a cocky smile. "Oh yeah, Sophia. How's she doing?" "She's doing better now that you're out of her life," I said, letting the words land like a punch. "But that's why I'm here, to make sure you stay out of it." Ethan leaned back, his smirk faltering. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Whatever issues Sophia's got, they're not my responsibility anymore. She's the one who—" "Stop talking." My voice was cold enough to freeze him mid-sentence. You've already done enough damage. I know about the money you took from her, the lies you told, the way you walked out when she needed you most. You're not just irresponsible, Ethan. You're a parasite. His face flushed with anger, but he stayed silent, his bravado crumbling under my gaze. Here's how this is going to work, I continued. You're going to disappear. No calls, no messages, no chance encounters. If I hear even a whisper that you've so much as glanced in Sophia's direction, I will make sure everyone in this city, and beyond, knows exactly who you are and what you've done. Ethan scoffed, trying to summon the courage to challenge me. Yeah? And how do you plan to do that? I reached into my pocket and slid a folder onto the bar in front of him. Inside were records, unpaid debts, complaints from former clients, evidence of his gambling problem, and a list of other women he deceived and abandoned. It was a carefully curated dossier, compiled by the investigator and ready to be shared with anyone who mattered. Ethan flipped through the pages, his face paling with every detail. You wouldn't, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Try me, I said, standing up and straightening my jacket. This is your one chance to walk away with what little dignity you have left. Take it. For a moment, he just sat there, his hands trembling as he clutched the folder. Finally, he nodded, defeated. Fine, I'm done. You won't hear from me again. You're right, I said, turning to leave. Because if I do, it'll be the last mistake you ever make. As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt a strange sense of closure. Ethan Gray was no longer a threat. Sophia was safe. When I returned to Sophia's apartment later that evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. Did you talk to him? She asked. I did, I said, setting my coat on the back of a chair. He won't bother you again. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the girl she used to be, the one who had once believed in fairy tales and happy endings. But life had hardened her, and now, she was rebuilding herself piece by piece. Over the weeks that followed, I focused on helping Sophia find her footing. I introduced her to a network of business contacts in Charleston, steering her toward a job at a local gallery. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start, and she quickly proved herself to be invaluable, her eye for detail and passion for art shining through. At home, we spent hours talking, truly talking. She asked about my life in Europe, my work, and the choices that had brought me back. I shared pieces of my journey, careful not to overwhelm her with the full weight of my transformation. In return, she opened up about her regrets, her dreams, and the fears she carried about raising her child alone. One evening, as we sat on the porch of her new apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me with a hesitant smile. You know, she said, her voice soft, I used to think you were weak. I thought that if you had just wanted more, maybe Mom wouldn't have left. Maybe everything would have been different. I stayed silent, letting her find her words. But now I see it wasn't weakness, she continued. It was strength. You gave everything to us, even when we didn't deserve it. And I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had carried the weight of her rejection, convinced that I had failed her. Hearing her say those things now felt like a balm on an old wound. I'm proud of you, Sophia, I said, my voice steady. You've made mistakes, we all have, but you're facing them. You're stronger than you know. She nodded, her eyes glistening. I want to be better, Dad. For my baby. For myself. You will be, I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. And I'll be here to help you. In the months that followed, Sophia flourished. She threw herself into her work at the gallery, impressing her colleagues and earning a promotion within 6 months. She joined a prenatal yoga class, made new friends, and began to embrace the idea of motherhood with a quiet determination. Our relationship deepened, too. She began to seek my advice, valuing the wisdom she had once dismissed. We spent weekends together, walking through the city, sharing meals, and preparing for the baby's arrival. For the first time in years, I felt like a father again. Though the scars of our past remained, they no longer defined us. Sophia was building a new life, and in doing so, she was helping me heal as well. Together, we were rediscovering what it meant to be a family. Not perfect, but stronger for the struggles we'd endured. The knock on my door came at 7 p.m., sharp and deliberate. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the staff at the Cypress Grove had been instructed to keep my privacy intact. When I opened the door, there she was, Julia, standing in the hallway, her posture elegant but her eyes betraying her desperation. "Daniel," she said softly, her lips curving into the same disarming smile I once fell for. "Or should I call you David now?" For a moment, I simply stared at her. It had been over a decade since we'd stood this close. Time had weathered her, though she still carried herself with the same poise that once captivated rooms. Her golden hair, carefully styled, hinted at the lengths she'd gone to maintain her image. But her dress, while well-tailored, lacked the subtle extravagance she once wore effortlessly. "What do you want, Julia?" I asked, my tone colder than the January breeze sweeping in from the marsh. She stepped closer, her perfume faint but familiar. "I wanted to talk. Just talk." I crossed my arms. "About what? The years you spent trying to erase me? Or the mess you've made of your own life since?" Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "I made mistakes, Daniel. We both did." I laughed, low and sharp. "Mistakes? No, Julia. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was calculated. You tore apart our family for a man who left you the moment you became inconvenient." She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. "I didn't come here to fight," she said quickly. "I came to apologize. For everything. For the way I treated you. For the way I turned Sophia against you. I see now that I was wrong." Her voice trembled, but I wasn't moved. "You see now?" I echoed, stepping closer. "What exactly do you see, Julia? That the life you traded us for was nothing but smoke and mirrors? That your charm can't buy loyalty, and your beauty can't buy love?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I pressed on. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt Sophia. You raised her to value status over substance, to believe that betrayal was acceptable if it got you ahead. And now, when your world has crumbled, you think you can waltz back into my life with a few pretty words?" She reached out, her voice breaking. "I don't know what else to do, Daniel. I'm losing everything. My friends, my reputation. Sophia barely even talks to me anymore. I don't have anyone left." For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly swallowed by the memory of all she had done. "You made your bed, Julia," I said firmly, stepping back. "Now you lie in it." I closed the door before she could respond. Her muffled sobs lingered for a moment, then faded into silence. News of Julia's downfall had become the talk of Charleston's social circles. It wasn't long before the whispers reached me. Once a fixture at every gala and luncheon, Julia was now persona non grata. Former friends avoided her at events, her invitations went unanswered, and even the charities she once championed found polite excuses to distance themselves. The final blow came when a local columnist, who had once fawned over Julia's style and charm, published a scathing exposé detailing her divorce from Victor Langston and her subsequent financial struggles. The piece, titled "From Queen to Pauper: The Fall of Julia Carter," spared no detail, painting her as a woman undone by her own ambition and arrogance. I read it with detachment, sipping espresso on the terrace of Sophia's new apartment. Julia's fall was of her own making, and while I didn't take pleasure in her suffering, I felt no sympathy either. As Julia's world crumbled, Sophia's loyalty shifted further toward me. Our bond, once fractured, grew stronger with each passing day. She began to see her mother not as the glamorous, larger-than-life figure she had idolized, but as a deeply flawed woman whose choices had caused immeasurable pain. The tension between them came to a head one afternoon when Sophia visited Julia at her cramped apartment in North Charleston. "Why don't you talk to me anymore?" Julia asked, her voice tinged with both hurt and accusation. "I'm your mother, Sophia. I raised you." Sophia sighed, crossing her arms. "You didn't raise me, Mom. You used me. You made me think Dad was the problem, when the truth is, you just wanted an excuse to leave." Julia's face twisted in indignation. That's not fair. I did what I thought was best for us. No, Sophia interrupted, her voice rising. You did what was best for you. And now that everything's falling apart, you expect me to pick up the pieces? I can't do it, Mom. I won't. Julia's expression crumbled. He's turned you against me, hasn't he? Your father. This isn't about Dad, Sophia said, shaking her head. This is about you. And until you're ready to take responsibility for what you've done, I don't think we have anything left to say. Sophia left without another word, tears streaming down her face. When she returned to my apartment, she was visibly shaken but resolute. I don't know if I can forgive her, she admitted as we sat on the balcony, the Charleston skyline glowing in the distance. You don't have to, I said gently. Forgiveness isn't something you owe her. It's something you do when you're ready, and only if you're ready. Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. She always told me you were weak, but she was wrong. You're the strongest person I know, Dad. Hearing those words from her, after everything we'd been through, was the closest thing to healing I'd felt in years. In the weeks that followed, Julia retreated further into isolation. With no allies left and no one to shield her from the consequences of her choices, she was forced to confront the wreckage of her life. Whether she would grow from it or continue to spiral was beyond my control, and, I realized, no longer my concern. My focus was on Sophia and the future we were building together. Julia's fall was a reminder of the cost of betrayal, but Sophia's growth was proof that even in the ruins, something beautiful could be rebuilt. The final confrontation was inevitable. Julia had exhausted every subtle attempt to approach me. Letters left unanswered, calls ignored, mutual acquaintances turned down as intermediaries. This time, she appeared unannounced, waiting for me outside Sophia's apartment as I returned from a meeting with her gallery director. Her appearance startled me. She looked thinner, the vibrancy that once defined her dulled by years of loss and rejection. Her designer clothes, though neatly pressed, seemed like relics of a life she could no longer afford. Her eyes, however, carried something I hadn't seen before: humility. Daniel, she said, stepping forward as I exited the car. I stood silently, letting the moment stretch before finally answering. What do you want, Julia? I want. She paused, searching for words that might penetrate the walls I'd built. I want to apologize. For everything. I crossed my arms, my expression unreadable. It's a little late for that, don't you think? I know, she said quickly, her voice trembling. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't keep carrying this guilt without at least trying to make things right. She stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her. You were a good husband, Daniel. A better father than I ever gave you credit for. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. And I'm sorry. For the betrayal, for turning Sophia against you, for all of it. Her voice cracked, and for the first time in years, I saw the woman I had once loved. The woman who had been lost to ambition and greed. I don't hate you, Julia, I said finally, my tone even but firm. I never did. But forgiveness isn't something you can demand. It's earned, and I've moved on. Our chapter is closed. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. I understand. I just needed you to know. As she turned to leave, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a trace of pity. Julia had finally confronted her mistakes, but her journey toward redemption would be a solitary one. 2 weeks later, the apartment buzzed with excitement as friends and family gathered for Sophia's gender reveal party. It was a warm spring afternoon, the Charleston breeze carrying the scent of magnolias through the air. Sophia had insisted on something small and intimate, a contrast to the over-the-top extravagance her mother might have planned. The backyard was decorated with pastel balloons and twinkling fairy lights, and the centerpiece was a white cake adorned with delicate fondant flowers. Sophia stood beside me, glowing with anticipation as everyone gathered around. Okay, everyone, she said, her hands resting on her growing belly. It's time. I handed her the knife, and she gave me a grateful smile before slicing into the cake. The room erupted into cheers as the inside revealed a soft, powder blue filling. "It's a boy!" someone shouted, and Sophia laughed, her face lighting up with joy. Amid the celebration, Sophia pulled me aside, her eyes misty. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, "for being here, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," I replied, resting a hand on her shoulder. "This is what family does." Months later, I stood in the hospital room, holding my grandson for the first time. He was tiny, his face scrunched as he squirmed in his swaddle. Sophia watched me from the bed, her exhaustion eclipsed by a radiant smile. "What's his name?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "Daniel Calloway Carter." I froze, the weight of her words settling over me. "Sophia, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," she interrupted. "You've given me, and this baby, everything. Naming him after you is the least I could do." For the first time in years, I felt my defenses crack. Tears blurred my vision as I looked down at the tiny boy in my arms. "You're going to do great things, Daniel," I whispered to him. Julia didn't attend the gender reveal or the birth. Sophia had kept her at arm's length, though they spoke occasionally. The distance between them was a natural consequence of Julia's past actions, but it also gave Julia the space to reflect. In the months that followed, I heard from mutual acquaintances that Julia had begun volunteering at a local women's shelter, using her charm and organizational skills to help others. She moved to a smaller, more affordable apartment and started working part-time as a consultant for a nonprofit. Her transformation was subtle and slow, but it was real. She remained alone, humbled by the life she had created, but no longer defined by it. As I sat in Sophia's living room one evening, baby Daniel asleep in my arms, I reflected on how far we had come. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had faded, leaving room for something new. Family wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, about finding strength in the broken pieces and building something stronger. Looking at my grandson, I felt hope. He was a fresh start, a symbol of all we had overcome. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that the future could be bright. The shores of Lake Como shimmered in the late afternoon sun, the water a perfect mirror of the sky. I stood on the terrace of my villa, a glass of Chianti in hand, watching the world turn quietly around me. It had been years since I'd left Charleston for the second time, and though I returned to Europe alone, my heart was no longer burdened by the weight of betrayal or regret. Sophia thrived. She had transformed in ways I hadn't dared to hope. Her career as an art curator had blossomed. Her gallery now showcased artists from all over the world, drawing acclaim from both critics and collectors. She had found a balance between her work and motherhood, raising little Daniel, now a rambunctious 5-year-old, with the same curiosity and resilience that defined her own journey. We spoke often, sometimes daily, thanks to the miracle of video calls. Seeing her smile as she told me about her day, the way she guided her son with gentle wisdom, filled me with a quiet pride. She had broken the cycle. She had escaped her mother's mistakes. My own life had taken a quieter turn. The man who once clawed his way to success in the bustling cities of Europe had found peace in simplicity. I still manage my investments and philanthropic endeavors, but now, my focus was on giving back. I funded scholarships for single mothers, invested in community arts programs, and supported literacy initiatives around the world. Every project I undertook was a small act of restitution, a way of ensuring that others wouldn't have to face the struggles I had. Yet, despite all my achievements, it was Sophia's transformation that I considered my greatest accomplishment. Helping her reclaim her life had been my redemption, the final step in my journey from betrayal to healing. One autumn, Sophia and Daniel came to visit me in Lake Como. Watching them step off the boat, Sophia carrying herself with confidence and Daniel clutching a sketchbook filled with his 5-year-old imaginings, I felt a warmth I hadn't known in decades. "Grandpa!" Daniel shouted as he ran toward me, his laughter echoing across the terrace. I caught him in my arms, lifting him high as he giggled. Sophia followed, her face glowing with joy. The days they spent with me were a glimpse of everything I had once thought lost. Family dinners on the terrace, long walks through the olive groves, and quiet evenings by the fire as Daniel showed me his latest drawings. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia and I sat together overlooking the lake. She sipped her wine, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about going back to Charleston?" she asked. I shook my head. Charleston is where my story began, but it's not where it ends. My life is here now, and so is my peace. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the water. "I get that, but I want you to know, I wouldn't be who I am without you. Without your support, your forgiveness. I'm proud to be your daughter, Dad." Her words settled over me like a balm. I reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "And I'm proud to be your father. Always." As I watched them leave, their boat disappearing into the distance, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. My life had been marked by trials I never expected, but it was in those trials that I found strength. Sophia was my legacy, and through her, I had reclaimed the meaning of family, of love, and of purpose. In the years that followed, I continued my quiet work, content in the knowledge that I had built something lasting, not in wealth or possessions, but in the hearts of those I loved. I had lived a life rebuilt from ashes, and in doing so, I had found peace. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Would you have handled Julia's betrayal or Sophia's struggles differently? Is forgiveness more about freeing yourself or repairing a relationship? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to Deceived Buddy so you never miss an update on more real-life stories. And as always, see you in the next video.